TORAEL presents this English classes series. I'm Kenny Takesi at the Economist Tokyo Bureau office. This program is planned and brought to you to feel close to British journalism. Today, we have great opportunity to talk with Henry Tricks, the Economist Tokyo Bureau chief, covering Japan and the Korean Peninsula. Henry-san, the Economist special reporter based in Japan, Into the Unknown was profiled on NHK last year. Henry-san was former FT Bureau chief in Mexico. He knows both Japanese and Mexico culture very well. I'm very excited to talk with Henry-san.
Thank you.
The first question is about your article. You wrote naive and delicate portrait of Japanese culture in Intelligent Life magazine. What attracted you most in exotic Japanese culture at that time?
When I'd arrived in Japan in 2009, I thought I was coming to one of the world's most modern, even postmodern countries. And I got here, and within weeks, after seeing my first omatsuri and going to museums, I actually realized that there was a very traditional side to Japan that ran very close to the surface, but that I hadn't expected to find. And so I was very struck by the influence of Japan's history on contemporary Japan. And the people that I would talk to would often refer me back to the Edo era, which I'd always assumed was a dark period in Japanese history, because from the outside we see Japan as being closed during that era to the outside world. But it was actually a very vibrant period within Japanese society, even though it was closed. And it seems like many of the attributes of Japan that we see today come from that time, or were honed at that time. So I found it fascinating to look at the influence of the Edo era on contemporary Japan, and that's why I set out to write that article.
So I've been reading The Economist for over 10 years.
Thank you. Keep it up.
Many world's top readers subscribe The Economist, you know. What makes the difference between The Economist and Newsweek, Time, FT, and Wall Journal?
Well, possibly the biggest difference is that The Economist is a magazine, but it looks like a magazine, but it calls itself a newspaper. And the point for that distinction is basically that we really focus on a weekly basis on news, but trying to give news more context and more argument, and possibly more opinion than you would find in a regular newspaper. So whereas some of the American weekly magazines, which have been very popular over the years and clearly have had much larger circulation in the past than The Economist, they've tended to recently stray more into the area of personality and pop culture and whatever. And we've stuck very much to the idea that news, serious news, is also interesting in its own right and should be given space and should be analysed. And so in that respect, I think we stuck very much to what we've always done in our 160 years of history, rather than necessarily being swayed by some of the fashions of magazine journalism as it's developed over the last 20 years. I mean, we have gone in the last 20 years from being a black and white publication to being one with colour, and but really the essence of The Economist has stayed pretty close to how it started, and we're very proud of that culture. In some ways I think that we're quite Japanese in the sense that we stick to our founding principles, and it's a very happy place to work. And luckily, our circulation has continued to rise, even during these difficult periods over the last few years, where not only has there been a global financial crisis that's hit the media industry, but there's also been this move of news onto the internet, which tends to have leached readers away from traditional publications. We're lucky in the sense that ours has held up during that time. So we've just got to continue to keep ourselves relevant.
I see. The most impressive article was in 2010 was Into the Unknown about Japanese grayish economy. NHK picked it up and broadcasted a special program. Several books about the demography problems were published. Why did you plan to issue it, and how was the feedback from both Japanese and world's readers?
Well, I didn't set out to write a special report on demography. I set out to write a special report that tried to come up with with my own view, if you like, on Japan after being here for a year. I was curious about the narrative of Japan. Often in the outside world, increasingly in the outside world, partly because of the rise of China, Japan has been slightly squeezed out of the news agenda, and 20 years of stagnation have not really helped build a great story about Japan. So I came here with a view that what I wanted to do was to find a really interesting new angle on Japan. And demography is not a new angle, but I found that every question that I asked would keep eventually coming back to the question of aging. So if I was looking at the Japanese economy, ultimately the question would be, well, is this an economy that's well suited to an aging population? Can you expect an economy to grow very fast when you have an aging population? The same with politics. Can you expect to have a very forward-thinking and innovative political system when you've got such a power of the vote in the hands of an elderly population? So in that sense, I started to look at, decided that I should wrestle with the subject directly. And it's a very interesting subject because we live in Tokyo, and in Tokyo we don't necessarily appreciate the aging phenomenon as much as one does outside of Tokyo, because here the population is still growing. It's still a relatively young population, and the economy is still growing in Tokyo as well. So one tends to think that aging is not such an immediate issue when you're here. But I've found that once you get out of Tokyo and you get into the hinterland, whether that is going up to Tohoku or going down to Kyushu, it really hits you in the face how the aging is really affecting the mentality of towns and villages around Japan, and how this is going to strongly influence Japan's policies over the next 20 or 30 years. So it became very obvious an issue to address. And you ask me, how did people react to it? I think in Japan I was pleased with the reaction, because I was very worried actually when I wrote the article or the series of articles that the Japanese readers would say, well, this is old news. We've known about this for ages. So what's new? What's the, why are you writing about this now? We've known about aging. but luckily it didn't happen like that. Luckily the reaction was, actually, yes, we are beginning to realize that this is an issue that needs to be tackled head on, and that might be partly because the baby boomers are about to retire. I mean, as you can see, the whole issue of the consumption tax with the current government is really an aging issue. I mean, you know, it's how to support a social security system that's being strained by aging. You know, so there's lots of reasons why. And as for outside, I think there's also an interest in looking at aging in Japan, because so many of our countries in Europe and elsewhere are facing similar problems, but Japan is on the forefront, so we need to see, you know, how is Japan coping as a lesson, I think, for our own economies on how to deal with it.
I see. So the next question, the difficult question. The British economy in 19th century sustained huge government bonds, over 300% of GDP, and avoided catastrophic consequences amid industrial revolution. And the article, A Third Industrial Revolution, changed our common belief that developed country can't sustain manufacturing. You state JGBX day or default is impending unless our political leaders change their mind. Do you consider there will be JGBX day in 10 years time frame unless without great politician?
I think that there is a risk of what in Japan you call X day, but it's a subtle risk. I don't believe that at the moment there is a grave risk that Japan will suffer the same kind of implosion that you're seeing in Greece, and that's really because Japan has lots of savings, both externally and domestically, and also that its domestic companies basically finance the deficit. So the Japanese, so Japan is not reliant on the outside world for its savings. But as we were just discussing, you know, Japan has an aging situation which is creeping up on it very fast, and that is increasingly likely to put strain on the budget, but also on the health system, the ambulance system, the long-term care system. There's all sorts of spending that's going to have to increase to cope with an elderly population. And the worry that I have is not so much that at this point that Japan will default to its creditors.
Yes.
It's more like that Japan could, in a sense, default on its social obligations to its own people. That because of the strains on public finance, that is actually unable to deliver the pension promises that it's made, the social security promises that it's made. I think that's probably true of many countries, and you know, there is a debate that's yet to be had around the world on how you cope with this kind of fiscal imbalance at a time when population is aging. So you know, you look around most of the aging countries, and like Japan, there are fiscal deficits everywhere, all through Europe, and yet there's this inexorable aging of society. So it's very, it's a looming problem, and it's a problem that needs to be dealt with in a much more aggressive fashion, a much more forward-thinking fashion than it is at the moment. But you also mentioned that the article that we had on the third industrial revolution.
Yes, impressive.
And to me, there is a hope in that article, because one of the problems for a country like Japan is that it's built up its economy based on an industrial structure that no longer can exist in an aging society, because the workforce is shrinking as opposed to growing. And Japan's whole model of manufacturing was built on the idea of a growing workforce. What the third industrial revolution talks about is a much more tailored manufacturing system that doesn't necessarily require a growing workforce. What it requires is in a sense, not mass production, but really focused production, and a lot more creativity in the production process. In order for Japan to capitalize on that, though, it will need to have a society that, even if it's aging, remains very young at heart. It still needs to be a very creative society. And the question is how you can encourage people from the age of 18 to the age of 80 to be much more creative and independent-minded in their production process. And I think that's a big question for Japan to deal with.
I see.
Well, it's a question for every country to deal with,
Yes,
but,
yes.
you know, yeah.
According to the Economist website, your book will be published in 2014. I imagine you will depict our changing culture and mentality. Could you elaborate more on your book?
I would say that, I mean, the book is likely, well, it's largely linked to the disaster of March the 11th. And what I'm doing is using the disaster and the way that Japan coped with that disaster and the way the Japanese people responded to it as a way of looking at Japan itself and trying to work out what is it that makes this country work. Why does Japan continue to be such a big economy and with such powerful businesses even after this supposed 20 years of stagnation? What is it that makes the economy tick? But also, what are the constraints to that? Why is it that when we look at Tohoku, we see all these aging villages with a very strong sense of community, but not a strong sense of where they're going in the future? So that's really what my book will be looking at.
Very interesting. I'd like to read it.
Thanks. I have to write it.
Yes. The Economist is the top quality and the most influential magazine on earth. So do you feel any kind of pressure while writing story, from the political pressure or corporate pressure and something? And could you please give message to current and future reader concerning future media coverage?
Sure. I mean, no, I don't feel pressure from, especially in Japan. I don't feel pressure from either politicians or companies. Clearly, sometimes they have a difference of opinion from us, and occasionally they let us know. But usually that fosters more of a discussion than making us feel that we need to change our coverage to adjust to what they think or what they want us to say. I think the pressure is much more from the point of view of our readers. We have to find ways of, we're writing not just for readers abroad, but we're writing for readers in Japan. And that's true of all of our reporters. We're writing for specialists who really know the subject and people who maybe have no idea about the subject but chance upon an article. So it's a delicate balance between not overcomplicating the issue for people who don't know anything about the subject, but nor oversimplifying it for people who do understand the subject very well. And getting that balance right is one of the most important tricks, I think, for a writer of The Economist. In terms of just the second part of your question, could you just
media coverage? The Economist heading for what direction?
What direction are we in The Economist heading towards? Well, this is an interesting question for everyone in the mainstream media at the moment. I mean, there is no doubt that the world is changing around us, and we're as aware of anyone that the internet provides enormous opportunities for us, but also provides tremendous competition. And no one can sit back and say we're confident that we'll survive another 160 years, because so much has happened. Just in if you just look at the last few years, many people now read The Economist on a screen rather than on paper. Many people read The Economist not just because they want to read the articles, but because they want to comment. And so, on the internet, what we're seeing is streams of commentary in which there is a community basically talking to each other. And often they seem their discussion is more related to an argument with each other rather than an argument with what they've read in The Economist. So there's that community which is emerging. There's clearly we're just moving into the era of big data. And there is that is really going to affect journalism, I think. The way that data is now used to tell a story is a very different form of journalism than going and sticking your microphone under someone and saying, what do you think, Mr. Prime Minister? So there's that issue, and the internet itself provides the opportunity for anyone to be a journalist, whether it's a blogger or whether it's a citizen journalist or whatever. So there's that competition as well from individuals, and we use those tools just like everyone else. I mean, we all have our favorite bloggers that we read. And sometimes they're inspirations for our articles, just like our articles are inspirations for their blogs. So, the most important thing is just to keep a broad mind and a broad eye on everything that's going on around you. And I find this quite interesting in Japan when I look at the media in Japan, because almost unlike anywhere else, so far the Japanese media seems to be ploughing on successfully with its very old model. I mean, the newspapers sell still millions of copies. They're the envy of newspapers around the world, because that game is over in the West. And what you see is the phenomenal growth of some newspapers online, for example. But it doesn't seem to have reached the shores of Japan as yet. And so it's going to be very interesting to see how this media model continues as well. It's quite extraordinary.
very solid structure based on the記者クラブ system and so on.
I mean, again, that seems like a throwback to the past. You know, in many other countries, you know, bloggers have just as much right to go to a press conference as someone from the Yomiuri Shimbun or from the, someone from a mainstream newspaper. And so it should be. There's absolutely no reason why the Kisha Club should be restricting access just to mainstream newspapers, because it defies reality, which is that many people now are not getting their news from those, or at some stage soon, many people won't be getting their news from those mainstream newspapers.
Yes, I agree with you. So I appreciate the Economist, since I think that every article is compact and analytical and comprehensive. So we can read each article within 5 minutes, but we can understand everything from your article for the technology or political side and corporate side. So our reader should read the Economist because of the quality.
Thank you.
And listen, thank you for taking time with us. We really enjoy it. From the world's most influential magazine, Tokyo Bureau Office.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Let me just say before we end that one of the difficulties that we understand from the Economist point of view is that it's written in English. It's written in an English that's very much from England rather than from America, and it's not. The language is not as easy for non-native speakers as possibly people expect. So it's wonderful for us to think that people in Japan are being encouraged to read The Economist, because we do want to be read here.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Henry-san. I'm Ken Takese with
Henry Tricks from The Economist. Thank you.
See you next week.